Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Thanks for listening, and thanks especially to those of you who subscribe to The Secret Show, which is another feed you can get that has an extra SLEERICKETS episode every week, including the weeks and months that the main feed is on hiatus. So do check it out. I think it's worth your time. I think it's a pretty good feed on its own. Well, not on its own. You do need to listen to the main feed, but I think it's a pretty fucking good feed. I'll stand by that. Go to sleerickets.substack.com to put in your email address and get a free week's access so you can see if I was just lying like the guys we're going to talk about today. So I have Brian on to discuss frauds and fraudulence with me and whether or not, in fact, everybody is lying all the time and nothing is true anyway. We'll get into all of that during the next hour. And then bad news, Jonathan, I'm still not going to start a parenting podcast, but good news, Jonathan, I do have a whole hour's worth of Brian and me discussing ridiculous child rearing problems. That's going to be on The Secret Show just to celebrate the big birthday you have coming up, which I definitely planned in advance and didn't just remember today. So that'll be up the next couple of days. But for now, here's Brian and me talking about lying guys who lie. All right. So initially, I sent you this article about Dan Ariely and Francesca Gino.
Yeah.
And they are social scientists who are very famous for these studies demonstrating both that people are dishonest and then, more importantly, that it is easy to manipulate people with subtle social nudges. So like a prominent example of Dan Ariely's work was scrolling down here, in the spring of 2007, he asked an insurance company if he could replace its ordinary automobile policy review form with experimental versions of his own. Customers had an incentive to underreport their annual mileage in order to pay lower premiums. Half the participants were to receive a form that asked them to sign an honesty declaration at the end. The other half were to receive an alternate version, meaning like you fill out your form with your mileage, but you at the end of that, you then have to sign a form saying like, oh, and I'm telling the truth. The other half were to receive an alternate version, which instructed them to sign a pledge at the beginning. The following year, on his first book tour, Ariely addressed a crowd at Google, where he was later contracted to advise on a behavioral science project, and he referred in passing to the experiment's results. Those who signed at the beginning, he said, had been more candid than those who signed at the end. This was all about decreasing the fudge factor, he said. In 2007, Ariely noted in the Harvard Business Review that the insurance company had updated its own forms to exploit this finding. So that's very typical of the kind of work he's done. And in fact, it's sort of like a model of his vision of humanity, which is like we're irrational, but we're also manipulable in ways that we can sort of like good policy can help guide us toward better behavior. And Obama loved this and picked up on it and implemented it in a lot of little ways in his administration.
Put signing statements at the top of tax forms,
and
fill out their taxes. They'd have to swear they were telling the truth as opposed to at the end.
Right. And this is the logic behind even like in a bathroom when it says like, remember, paper towels come from trees or this kind of thing.
Yep.
So this is
taken over our culture. This brand of social science has been sort of universally accepted.
Yes. And the article, and some of this had begun to come out, is partly about this group called Data Colada, which is just like three social scientists who spend a lot of time going through the detailed data of these studies.
Can you explain the pun? What's the joke? I don't get why it's called Data Colada.
I was confused, but it's so Data Colada, I assume, is a like non-pun on pina colada.
But I don't get it. What does a pina colada have to do with that? I don't get the other part of right. Like it sounds like that, but but it doesn't really sound that much like that. Again, not the point. I just kept on.
Yeah, so
not getting
pina colada is that's what it is. Is washed pina, pineapple, and so data colada is like cleaned data, washed data. So they're like the data cleaners, I think is the idea, but I think mostly it's just sort of like a goofy internet pun.
Okay, great.
Because this, I mean, in fairness to them, they are like they're the guys who like started this little jokey blog thing that then like, oops, we have that name. We're stuck with it.
That's fair. And they are very much the heroes of this New Yorker story.
Yes, and they are hated by many social scientists. They are in part responsible for highlighting what has come to be known as the replication crisis, because as it happens, many of these studies don't replicate, meaning when you try to run them again, the results turn out different. But
meaning also that they're not scientific, right?
Well, they're two different. So there are two different things that happen. Like one is that you run a test and it may not be well designed, or you may be picking and choosing your data, or it may be too small, and you get results, but then those results are basically just luck, because
they're correlations, not causations in this,
or they're just like
instance.
You had one particular group that had one particular set of results, and you get a different group with different results. So yeah, like the scientific method is all about what's measurable, but then also what's repeatable, what's consistent over time. The other thing that happens, though, is that with Ariely's research in particular, and with Francesca Gino's research, and they've worked together as well as separate, but it's a very similar story for the two of them. Ariely's
and they're both superstar millionaires off of the science.
Huge, very famous, very, very well respected, very prolific, constantly invited to talk and to give opinions and things, constantly publishing a colossal amount, both of them. And in their case, it seems to be that much of the data was not merely wobbly and inconsistent, but fabricated. They just made up the data, or they made up aspects of it, or they bent the truth or stretched the truth. So like much of what he said about the insurance form example, down to the insurance company adopting his findings and applying them in the future, none of that's true. Like some very, very mild, if you squint at it, version of the initial correlation is sort of true, but it doesn't even, if you look at the data clearly, it doesn't even really indicate what he says it indicates. And then everything beyond that is a fabrication. And in some cases, there are things like, oh, well, that's interesting. That's a really interesting finding, yet you never published it. You just talked about it a lot in public. And then you used it to get other opportunities. So this seems to be pretty well documented, that like a lot of these studies, like they're very, very prolific, and a lot of the studies are just false, or they're like half false, or they're it's we're going to talk about another example where there's a little more flexibility to the concept of a half truth, but half truth in science is falsehood. It seems to me like you can't do that with data and studies. You can't have a half truth with data and studies, because if you're manipulating the results, then it's not science anymore.
I think you've done a great job of summarizing the article. I have my own perspective on this. Before I tell you it, why did you think this was worth discussing? Because I have a very sort of strong predisposition in this realm, which we've talked about before, and which I'm excited to articulate again. But like, what about this caught your eye?
So the question that immediately presented itself. So for one thing, I'm obsessed with frauds. Like I have a weird obsession with frauds. I was talking to my my poor poetry ladies I do a poem with once a week. Like we take a prompt, and it was my week for the prompt, and sometimes one of them's an environmental scientist, and so she'll like send a sentence from a science thing she's reading, and I sent like a long 2 paragraphs and a lengthy addendum from a book on financial fraud. And they were like, yeah, this is a lot to think about. And they're like, this is not a prompt. This is terrible. But I have a minor obsession with people who are frauds in all realms. But so like any kind of fraudulence, especially an intellectual fraudulence, is going to be interesting to me. the question that came to mind, because there was a moment in there that I think that really gave me pause. It was about Gino in particular, and Gino published a lengthy and detailed rebuttal to this, which we can get into a little bit, saying,
well, which is I think worth acknowledging, if not delving deeply into, because she essentially calls the New Yorker writer a fraud.
Yes, she says a lot of the facts are reported by the New Yorker writer are inaccurate, and she also says that or incomplete. And then she also says that the presentation is prejudicial, is like it gives an impression of her as a person that is not really fair and even-handed.
But again, let me stick this landing just for a moment, and then I'll let you continue to tell the story. But what you just said is pretty much exactly what she is accused of, except in a different realm.
Yes,
she is accusing the New Yorker writer of fudging the hard data in order to tell a narrative, in the same way that the New Yorker writer is accusing her of fudging the hard data in order to tell a narrative.
Totally. And part of the difference seems to be the difference not between the Francesca Gino offered that sort of one person's documentation of inaccuracy versus several, but the bigger difference seems to be the difference between journalism and science. Like, is it a bit like effectively like it's a bigger deal when you do that in science than when you do the same thing in journalism, perhaps, or maybe not, but
totally agree. And I think where it gets squishy is in this soft science, behavioral science, where replicability is necessary for any of it to make any sense, but groups of people behave in different ways, and can you really have a control to an experiment if you're taking a group of students versus a group of Chinese old people versus a group of American children? Like, I know that the answer is yes, there are ways to control for all this data. I'm not like bringing up a flaw into the entire system nobody's thought of, but it's not the same as at what temperature does water boil at what altitude, right? Like, it's there are just like more variables, and therefore more opportunity to hack the data, to find what you're to find a strong thesis. And again, similarly to what the New York article is trying to find here, which is a strong thesis.
Right. And the double-edged sword is that with social science, especially, there is often a very direct impact on things like corporate and legal policy. So that, like, when you publish a study about fruit flies, it will have some effects, but it may be a very narrow, controlled effect. When you publish, particularly not just like a study on insurance forms, but a trend, a series of studies that all point in the same direction, which is that people are nudgeable and manipulable, that ends up having a big effect on policy overall. And that's a double-edged sword, because the social scientists, especially Dan Ariely, will often say things like, well, it's getting at a larger truth and it's for a greater good. But also, a critic might say, you're affecting policy with studies that are not true. Like, that's a big deal. The line that leapt out at me and that made me wanted to send it to you was when one of Gino's colleagues said, she published like 10 large studies last year in major journals. Anybody who publishes that much, there's something funny going on, because you just can't do that much science that quickly, that at that level. Like, all of them were groundbreaking studies, and like that's too much too quickly. The thought that came to mind for me was like, okay, is there a meaningful equivalent of that in literature?
Well, first I want to stick with, I think
we can get to literature later. But that was the question that maybe you want to send it to you initially.
I mean, where I struggle with articles like these is I have no idea if you're have a major professorship at I think Gino is at Harvard, Ariely is at MIT. Like, can you produce a dozen major studies if you have all these grad students and other professors working with you? Like, I just don't know. And it's all stated as obvious, and I'm willing to take that statement at face value to a certain extent.
And
Once
that
again,
is a colleague of hers saying that. So that is a more
I
informed
understand.
person that, yeah.
Before I give you my perspective on this, do you have an angle or a general, if not conclusion, at least like attitude towards any of these characters that you'd like to say unvarnished before I throw the polyurethane all over
Sure.
town?
Yeah, partly I'm in reading this, I realized like I take, and it's like you recommended a similar article also in the New Yorker very shortly beforehand about Hassan Minhaj, whom apparently everybody's been saying his name wrong. But part of the reason I had even avoided that one initially is that I have too much of an inclination naturally to be gratified by stories of people who seem to be big successes like this turning out to be frauds. Like I'm in a way like this too much serves my own prejudices of
Yep.
assuming that like many people who appear to be successful and are revered are actually fundamentally fraudulent. And this was the thing I sent my colleagues was that my poetry ladies was that of this list of like the 50 most best and most like morally admirable leaders selected by the two top headhunters in the country, within 10 years, like 3 were in prison and 6 others had looked, had overseen like major crimes or financial failures.
Yeah.
So like I always have an expectation for that to be the case, which makes me then doubt myself in looking at something like this. I have a slightly more nuanced sense of it, but like that, my prejudice going in is like, oh boy, more frauds. But then I think like, well, is that do I just want this to be true?
Yeah. I am unfortunately aligned with that vision of the world. And far more than that, I live with the assumption that everything is fake, that everything I see is a lie,
Yeah.
that it's all a story, that it's none of it is real. And I realize that's a very aggressive and sort of shticky statement, but I think I really believe that. I think almost all journalism is not fake news the way Trump has said it. I believe the New York Times gets as close as anyone to trying to articulate some vision of the truth. But I don't fully believe in nonfiction narrative. I don't read biography because I don't think it's real. I think it's some guy telling a story. I don't read social science or believe in any of these conclusions because I don't think it's real. I think Malcolm Gladwell is just the same as these scientists, where he's a good presenter of things, some of which are true, some of which aren't, and there's no way to know, and some of which are obvious, some of which are false. Like I just don't know. When Jonah Lehrer was the Malcolm Gladwell of the moment,
Yeah.
about a decade ago, and was publishing in the New Yorker nonstop, as well as some scientific journals, and it turned out he had lied about Bob Dylan quotations. So then they looked deeper, and it turned out that some of his lies, some of his other essays were full with mistruths. Like you, my thought was, of course, like this is all pretend. Like none of this social science is real. None of what Malcolm Gladwell writes is real. None of what Hassan Minhaj is saying is real. None of what Jonah Lehrer is writing is real. None of what these biographies or autobiographies write are real. So I wrote, there was this book that came out called Losers, edited by a wonderful couple of sports journalists. And it was a real book. It was like Random House or something published it, and they got a bunch of writers to contribute chapters. And I had a professional relationship with Louisa Thomas, who's one of the two editors, a wonderful sports writer for the New Yorker. She and Mary Pylon did it together. Mary's also a great writer. Both of them have written books, and I really think highly of both of them. So I heard this project was underway, and I reached out to Louisa and volunteered an essay because I thought this sort of nonfiction narrative reporting on sports losers would be in my wheelhouse in a fun way. And I'm sure you remember, because I asked you to read a draft for me, and you had excellent notes. But basically, what my reporting was I stepped very much out of my lane, and I met up with this ping pong prodigy who was the best table tennis prodigy, who was one of the best table tennis stars that America produced in years. And he either physically or psychologically collapsed and didn't end up winning the match that everybody thought he would win, and didn't end up making the Olympic team. And there were some documentaries about him. So I interviewed him, and then I interviewed his best friend, who was another ping pong table tennis prodigy. And I spent hours with both of them. And then
quick sidebar. What is
yeah,
their response to the term ping pong? Is that like a racial slur to them? Like, what is ping pong? Is that like when you
ping
call
pong
a
is more of a
unitarian
game, where table tennis is more of a sport. It's totally
Oh,
arbitrary.
that's even like flimsier than I thought. That's
It's
okay.
nothing.
Sorry.
It's nonsense.
All right.
And even
Yeah.
they use the two terms interchangeably. So it's
Okay.
not,
All right.
it's not, it's not offensive in the way. I
Right.
was taught to use ping pong. I was taught, you see, I just did it again. I was taught to use
Yeah.
table tennis.
This is like the school I used to run was owned by the what do they call themselves? The Unity Church something. But like everybody knows them as the Moonies, and they're like, well, Moonies is a very offensive term. And so I was like, oh, well, the Moonies is an offensive term, but also you're a cult. Like you're run by a criminal. So like that's not that offensive. I don't know. Sorry, yeah, go
Yeah,
go ahead.
totally. I met with them, and I really did it. Like I bought an app on my phone to record everything that they were saying, so we could have the conversation. I transcribed all the interviews. It took hours and hours. And I was left with these stories of these two potentially sport changing athletes who didn't make it to as high a realm as they wanted to in table tennis. And then I just fucking told a story. Like, and then I just sort of made it up, like no one wanted to see the facts weren't interesting. The facts were like, he won 22-17, and then 22-20, and then 21-17, then 21, then he lost a bunch of games, and then he was born here, and then his friend had these results, and who cares? So I sat back and I'm like, so what is the interesting story to tell? And I inserted myself in there as a character, and I started from their childhood rivalry, and then I went and I told some stories about how their parents raised them differently, and one kid came from a better home, and how the failure of one led inevitably to the failure of another, and then the other second failure who failed worse is still trying to do it, and he had an injury, and now he's playing lefty, and can people perform left? And I don't know, I just wrote stuff, and it was I sent it to you as a draft, and you're like, this is really good, I think you wrote, but your advice was to put more scenes of them playing table tennis in. So I wrote some scenes where they were playing table tennis, and I talked about spring-loaded nature of his grip, like an anaconda at his prey, and I don't know, I wrote some stuff, and nothing I wrote was a lie.
Right.
Nothing I wrote was
like there were no statements you made where somebody could point to that and say like,
this
no, that
isn't
is
what
false.
happened.
Right.
But I pretty much took real people and I put them into this engaging narrative.
Right.
And it was published in this book, and like, I don't know if anyone read it or not, but it was reviewed by people, and most people who reviewed the book didn't mention mine, but like one review, I think it was in the Washington Post, like mentioned mine specifically as like as an astute psychological reading of professional losers, and then it went away. And my point is only that that's the way these things are written. Like I was doing my best to write a nonfiction narrative telling the story of these people with a lot of potential who didn't, succeed. And I narrativized it to the point where it would become readable. And I just think that's not so different from what Gino does, or what Gladwell does, or what Minaj does, or what Jonah Lehrer did, or when he was allowed to. It's just I just assume everybody is I was going to say not lying, but essentially lying, like fabricating a narrative. And once you fabricate a narrative, the facts don't matter. We know that. We can take facts and turn it into any narrative you want. And I I sincerely don't want to get into Israel, Gaza stuff now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
though I bring it up all the time because it's all anybody in my
Yeah.
realm is
Yeah.
talking
Yeah.
about now. But I it's why any type of certainty, moral certainty at
Right.
the most part, but just strikes me as so obviously misbegotten. Like anybody who is sure of anything based on facts or narrative or interviews or figures or research, I just don't buy it. I don't
Right.
believe it. And I made the distinction earlier between like the boiling point of water at certain altitudes. And I
Right.
do believe that. So I don't know exactly where the line gets drawn between hard science that I
Right.
believe and everything else. Like again, math. Like I believe the math insofar as I
Right.
understand math, I believe it. And then I'm sure I could understand more math and still believe it, but my ability or I don't know, stamina to understand, multivariable calculus, I lose at a certain point. And then I believe the math insofar as I understand it.
Right.
Science
Like the
is
guy who
math
like
to a certain
solved
part.
Fermat's last theorem a few years ago, like he didn't actually just do doodles instead.
Right.
Like
I
he actually
believe
did
that
the
the
yeah,
math works. But again, that's faith to a certain point. But
sure.
other than math, science, like I believe foreign language, I believe languages, like words have meaning and I can learn French. I believe that. I don't, I'm just naming academic uh,
Yeah.
ventures. But at a certain point, I just don't believe it. I don't think you can teach an objective history. I don't think you can tell an objective story. Objective and true now I'm muddling, so I'm getting a little bit confused. But I think everybody's a con artist for different
Yeah.
reasons than you do. I think you believe everybody's a con artist because you're thirsty for moral frailty. I believe everybody's a con artist because I just don't think that there is anything other than a con, and which is why I
Yeah.
believe that I spend my time reading fiction and not nonfiction because I get the premise from which we're working. I don't
Right.
I
Okay.
yeah.
So I don't know what the opposite of a devil's advocate is. Like the devil's prosecutor, devil's, I don't know.
Yeah,
But
you're instead of like a straw man, you're steel manning an argument or something
well,
like
or
that.
but like rather than saying like you're giving the devil's advocate position, right? You're advocating for
Except
you're
I believe it, right? The definition of the
oh
devil's
true. Oh, right.
advocate
Yeah, is that
is
it's
that
hypothetical. Yeah. Yeah.
you're performing the role of the
Right.
devil, where you're just advocating for the devil's
Yeah.
perspective. But I really believe what I'm saying, which is that anytime I've ever been an expert in something that I then saw an article about, the article was wrong. Anytime someone writes an article about what
Yeah.
private school is really like, that article is wrong. Anytime someone writes
Yes.
what Bed-Stuy gentrification is really like, that article is wrong. And it just
Yeah.
every single time I have lived expertise about something, and then someone tries to get a sense of what that thing is and articulate it to a broader audience, it's wrong. Which makes me think
Yeah.
that everything is wrong. It just
Oh, okay, but like, all right, as with the Hassan Minaj case and the Dan Ariely case, like there is a difference between like constructing an emotional momentum that suggests a psychological causality over the course of a friendship, which seems like what you did, and saying like, oh, and then one time he was flown by private jet by a mysterious donor to go play a one-on-one match in North Korea, and then at the last minute, Kim Jong Un came in, and he was so impressed that even though the American guy lost, Kim Jong Un was so impressed that he personally gave the guy a high five and said like, if you ever want me to assassinate someone for you, I'd be happy to because you showed such heart in playing, even though you didn't end up winning in the end. And then it turns out that like the guy's actually never been to Asia.
I get it. I
Like
get it.
like
And
and
that's a
that's what
type of
happened in a lot of these cases where they just
I
like
know.
made and then their justification is like, well, it gets at something that is true. It is consistent with a larger truth, and it is a good way to persuade people of something that is broadly true.
Sure. And just to try to control all of these different threads, I am okay with Hassan Minhaj doing that in
Yeah.
a one-man show stand-up special, and I am not okay with a scientist doing that in order to change public policy. But I do think that they're doing something similar, even
Yes.
lying.
Yeah.
I'm okay.
So the slightly more nuanced take I have on this is because briefly, Hassan Minhaj is a stand-up comic. He also had a TV show called Patriot Act for a while, where he would do Daily Show style. He started on the Daily Show, and then he would do sort of Daily Show style newsy comedy things, where he would talk about current events and kind of make jokes and kind of tell stories. And a lot of his stand-up, which was not limited to a stand-up, but also extended to like interviews he would do later.
Yep.
He would tell stories that, even like in an interview with Mark Maron says like, well, you were really lucky in that you had all these like crazy things happen to you.
Yep.
And he did have these wildly picturesque stories happen to him, that kind of each of which demonstrated a major social truth about racism, or about like the FBI, infiltrating his mosque, or a girl turning him down for prom because of the color of his skin, literally. And the New Yorker story is that many of these anecdotes did not happen, or they happened only very loosely, or they happened with many of the details changed. It seems like the biggest like slander or libel, however it translates when it's recorded on video, was against the FBI informant, and his response to that seemed to be like, well, that guy was a piece of shit, and
Yeah,
he did a
exactly.
similar thing to other people, so I don't really care
Yep.
if I told a lie about him. But
Yes.
his argument was, I didn't do it on my show. I only did it in my stand-up, and I'm getting at a larger truth, and some of it's true. And he similarly had a rebuttal saying like, well, you told misleading stories to me. I watched his rebuttal first and then read the article, and I found that the article is actually a lot more even-handed than I expected it to be, based on his rebuttal to it.
Yes.
But yeah, my thought was like, he's doing something very similar to Dan Ariely. It is way more acceptable when you do stand up. And I think the thing he said in his rebuttal was like, oh, if I misled some people, I'm sorry. If I misunderstood some things, and it didn't seem like there were some honest, different understandings he had with people. But he said like, I'm a flawed person. I'm a neurotic person. He did some stand up shtick. He said, but I'm not a total,
Psychopath.
total psychopath, right?
Yeah.
And my thought is like, this guy, Hassan Minhaj, Jonah Lehrer, Dan Ariely, Francesca Gino. I thought of Dan Mallory, who's also had that story in the New Yorker years ago. Not who was the guy who wrote The Woman in the Window, but was also like a crazy talented Mr. Ripley-esque like fraud criminal, and then like wrote a book, but maybe the whole book was sort of plagiarized. And so like was very successful as an agent, was very successful as a novelist, totally chewed people up and spat them out along the way, and like lied to everybody. And like Paul Damon, who I only, like his he was like
I don't know about that.
revered as an academic and a theorist for years. And then after his death, it turned out like a lot of shady things came out about him that happened during the war, and that he misrepresented a lot of his background. And like, I read his translation of Madame Bovary, and then it turns out that basically like what happens with so many of these people was like, he was so overbooked, like everybody was asking him to do everything,
Yeah.
that he just had his wife translate it, and then he like touched it up. So like, my thought is like, so many of people are just like on a spectrum of ambitious psychopath, and they have some degree of that, and some degree of like, justifiable massaging, and some degree of like go-getterism, and they sort of fall at different places on the spectrum, and maybe
Right.
in
And
different fields and at different levels.
yes,
At different fields and at different places on the spectrum, it's more or less acceptable.
I totally agree with that, except that I would push it further, and I would put, it's not some people, I would say it's most people, and maybe so many people that you can't take anything that is published or written as nonfiction at face value or seriously. So to go back to the analogy that you were made to my table tennis piece, I did make up a story about how this friendship led to certain results, in their lives. I didn't say that then somebody was flown to whatever your,
Yeah.
North Korea
You
fantasy
didn't make up
was.
events that never occurred.
But the thing that I would have done if I were Malcolm Gladwell is not make up events that never occurred, make up a rule about the way to live life
Right.
based on this friendship,
Yeah,
where I
yeah,
would
yeah.
say, in order to be a truly successful athlete, you need to have a slightly more successful athlete of whom you're jealous early in your life.
Yeah,
So the podcaster Bill Simmons says that he has noticed a lot of, this is real. He says that he has noticed a lot of a lot of basketball superstars having older siblings whom they competed against in their life, who didn't turn out to be as
right.
superstarish as they were, but because they were older and bigger, the younger sibling had to compete to a certain extent.
Right.
And like, is that true? I don't know, maybe, probably
Yeah,
not.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And like
Should
Malcolm
you
Gladwell,
strive to like cultivate an older failure and then a younger
right,
success in
right,
your
right.
children?
And
Yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell just has a gazillion of these. He just
Yeah,
pumps
yeah, yeah.
these out,
Yeah.
and some of his most famous ones were that like the hockey players in Canada, everybody wants to play hockey. And it's not a coincidence that it turns out that people born in January, February, and March are overrepresented by like 90% in terms of NHL players, because they're the ones who junior hockey leagues start when you are, they're grouped by age. So they're
Right.
the
Yeah,
ones who
yeah, yeah.
dominate in the first couple of years. And then if you look at like American presidents, there's something similar where they are the oldest ones in their class at a certain,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
at a certain age, and that leads to leadership skills, etc. So he says that, and like, is that true? Maybe, probably,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
can you lead to other things with that? Probably not. But he just has
Yeah.
like a gazillion theories and he writes them
Right.
up in compelling narratives. So if I were to do the sort of sleight of hand that you are talking about, I would have said it's the table tennis best friend rule. So what everybody needs, is a best friend coming from a bad neighborhood who pumps you up and gets you to succeed. But the reason that didn't work is this, etc. And it would just
Yeah,
be
yeah.
like this same social science nonsense that Ariella and Gino have made their careers on. But I am willing to sort of state that as entertainment, all of this is acceptable. And if you want to read these social science essays in the same way you watch Hassan Minhaj, like as a brain teaser, like
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
fantastic. But I think that the same way that I read the New York Times opinion pages, and not just the New York Times, the way I read all of the Atlantic and all of Slate and all these, my friend Matthew Iglesias is a very successful Substack, and sort of all of these, public intellectual types. I don't take any of it as true. I take it as compelling sophistry. And that's where I would put Gino and Gladwell and Minaj and Lehrer and Ariely and Iglesias and Thomas Friedman and all of the famous opinion writers and columnists. I would put them in a similar category as Jon Stewart and the Jimmy Fallon. Like, it's just it's all Jimmy Kimmel. I just think Paul Krugman. Like, I think that there's an attempt to.
But there's a spectrum there, right? Like there's
I
like
don't
pure.
know. I don't
I
know.
think Jimmy Kimmel is maybe doing a similar thing to Malcolm Gladwell, but they are at different places on the spectrum.
They're accorded different amounts of respect, and there is a cultural spectrum, but I think that all of them are essentially telling stories with facts at their core. Where does Malcolm Gladwell fit on that spectrum, from entertainer to academic to? I think
I don't know where to pinpoint him, but like at a slightly different place than Jimmy Kimmel would be my claim. Like, these are different, and also at a slightly different place than somebody who's doing original research, right? Like Darren Ariely is also at a different place on that spectrum.
Yes, they would all put themselves at different places on the spectrum.
But I
and
think
their
like a
audience
reasonable person would also put them at different places. Like there are different games to play that are, there's a degree of storytelling and there's a degree of fact finding, but they're not all exactly the same thing just because they have common ingredients. It's sort of like saying all Italian food is the same dish.
No, I understand.
No, it has like tomato, basil, and mozzarella, but it's
right. I agree with what you're saying, and I think that a periodical where I spend most of my time, the New York Times, which I know the most about because my wife works there and I've written some articles for them and I read it, every day. It's clear that a reporter who's doing a story on New York City government in Albany is called to a higher factual standard in my mind than Hassan Minhaj,
Yeah.
whether on his one-man show or on his TV show. But if it turned out that a reporter for the Times was hyping up a politician in maybe a way that didn't exactly happen, would I be surprised? The answer is definitely not.
But like you wouldn't be surprised, but like because that also has happened. But like
it would be a larger sin.
Yeah, like
but
would there be reason to say like, oh, maybe that person shouldn't be doing that job versus like people are going to when people go to a Minhaj show, they're going for, as you said, like a particular kind of brain tickling, pleasing, like facty, entertainment-y, comedy-ish stuff. They're going to have that feeling. And when they go, they get to have that feeling. That's not exclude, like there is something slightly different you're hoping to get from the New York Times. And I think, again, not to flirt with Israel and Gaza without getting into it, like part of what is so striking about this particular conflict is that people speaking on behalf of Palestine and people speaking on behalf of Israel, both in like, I think, good faith and with like strong moral feelings and justifications, claim in very seriously that the information coming out of the other side is fabricated. That
Yes.
like the news, the facts you are hearing from Israel or the facts you are hearing from Gaza are lies that are deliberately constructed to mislead you. Like that makes like digesting any of this almost impossible.
And the problem, to take another step down the civic duty role, is that leads to a dismissal of all fact,
right,
which is where you get to Trumpian, in my opinion. I think more, Putin as a way that maybe more of us will agree with, just like being able to define a country's set of facts and create a narrative. And that is dangerous, which is why I think that it is important that we have something like the New York Times that not everybody, but most people can believe is at least doing its best to,
but also importantly that
truth.
Internally upholds a standard of
truth telling, right? I totally agree.
Yeah.
But where I get a little anxious about this is where Minhaj is trying to say there is of course I tell stories in my one-man show. It's a one-man show. I would never do that on my television show.
Sure. Yeah.
And you think, what the fuck are you talking about? Who is making this distinction between your one-man show and your television show? Unfortunately, I hear all the time people saying the Times is a leftist organization, and people at the Times saying, of course we let our opinion columnists, write leftist opinions. That has nothing to do with what we report in our, page A1 news reporting. And it makes me anxious because I know that the Times believes that fundamentally, and that is they're not trying to get one over on anyone. There is a strong, strict line between those divisions. But Minhaj believes that too, between his stage one-man show performance and his television show on Netflix, where I believe that the Times is doing it for real and is upholding an important church and state distinction between opinion and reporting. Minhaj believes that for real, that he's withholding this church and state division between his TV show and the one-man show. I think it's fucking insane that anybody would listen to Minhaj when he creates that distinction. I think it's fucking insane that anybody would not understand the difference between an opinion coming from the New York Times and obviously this isn't a healthy way to impart information in society. To complicate this further, you were saying, yes, people go to Minhaj's one-man show for brain tickling in a way that they don't go to the New York Times for purely brain tickling. I think that's probably right. But have you read any of these founding father biographies? Have you read any of George Washington?
And that's I mean, definitely like there is an element to so much popular history that is
way
the
closer to
massaging
the.
of a certain feeling about the country. And that is also very true for plenty that has a very progressive leaning as well. That like
100%,
a lot,
yes.
which is even like explicitly a point that people were making a lot a few years ago when they talked about moral clarity in journalism and saying like it was less important to try to be objective than to get at the important truth and get across. I mean, this is part of what like drove me crazy during the the peak of COVID was like the conversation about like, well, what message is it important for people to hear versus like, well, what is the actual known medical scientific situation? Like, there's a strong concern with messaging and with how people will respond to information depending on whether we tell them or not and what we tell them or not. I think like that's really hard to extract from the news these days. Like it's really, I think you're right that there is a meaningful difference between an opinion piece and a reported piece, but also like the Times is kidding themselves if they think like having a staff that is almost all very progressive is not going to influence like which stories they tell, which people they talk. Like they have discipline and they are doing like it is meaningful to say like this is opinion and this is reporting. That is a real distinction, but that there's no leaning that derives from like who you're hiring and who works there and what culture you have is also a little bit fantastical.
I totally agree. And I would say that the big difference between the Times and Fox News is that the Times acknowledges the fact that almost everybody who works there is a New York City liberal member of the liberal elite and tries to correct for that to the best they can, where Fox News just leans into their, I don't even know what they would call it, their leanings, but I just said lean into their leanings. The problem with all of this is that I am simultaneously saying that I pretty much trust nothing I read to be factual.
But you also say that you trust the New York Times.
I see that. But even the Times, anytime the Times writes an article about anything I'm very knowledgeable about, it strikes me as not fraudulent, but tangential to the truth, in some way. But I'm both saying that like I am almost a fatalist when it comes to just like not believing anything I read to be accurate, and acknowledging the fact that not believing anything one reads to be accurate can really lead to a broken society. Like I'm not proud of the fact that I don't believe anything I read to be accurate. I think it's fucked up and terrible, but I do. I don't read much nonfiction because I assume it's all either factually wrong in the minority or in the massive majority, just somebody telling some story.
This is like you're like Socrates. It's like because like his claim was that
you can just stop it there. I am like Socrates. I don't need further explanation than that. You don't need to tell me why I'm like Socrates.
You have ambiguously sexual relationships with prepubescent boys.
Exactly.
But like he was like, I mean, the argument was that he was the wisest man in Athens because he wasn't under the impression that he knew anything, whereas everybody else thought they knew things that they didn't know. And like what is funny is like the argument, and I think like the good faith argument, lots of people give for like, oh, what, like particularly middle-aged men at this point give for why they read mostly nonfiction is, well, I want to read things that really, I want to learn things that really happen. But like what you're effectively saying is like, well, no, if you read a bunch of nonfiction, you're not necessarily going to know more things than I know, but you will have the impression that you have learned things. Whereas I at least know that I'm reading fiction.
That's exactly right. And going back to the Israel-Palestine or Israel-Gaza conflict, however you want to articulate, is Israel-Hamas conflict.
Even that's the thing is like even finding any way to name it has become like significantly
is what makes me craziest about the conversation is not the factual uncertainty, which I understand. It's the moral certainty expressed by people who refuse to acknowledge the possibility of factual uncertainty. Like it's the people who are so sure that they're right that I just don't. I'm having a lot. So I am the I really do have to be careful professionally here.
Sure, sure,
But
sure.
I am the faculty moderator, the faculty member who runs the Jewish affinity group in the middle school at a Christian school.
Mm-hmm.
So I am regularly having conversations with students and parents who are feeling as though the perspective of Jews right now is underrepresented.
We had a
And
brief conversation a while ago about like, oh, is anti-Semitism a thing right now? And it was sort of a lighthearted conversation. And that seems to be like, there are some people who were very concerned then, but it seems like that may have really changed recently. Like that may be a very different atmosphere.
profoundly. And I think it's because some Jews believe that there is and I count myself among this category, that it is possible and logical to have opinions about Israel and separate those from having opinions about Jews.
Yeah.
Some Jews believe that to have negative opinions about Israel doesn't necessarily mean, but correlates to a very, very, very high extent with anti-Semitism. And it leads to a lot of conversations where I am sitting there playing the role of just saying, like, none of us have moral authority over this moment. Working yourself up into a frenzy to defend the murdering of children on either side is just really like dopey. Like it just doesn't make any sense to me. Like if everything people are saying about Hamas is true, and I have no reason to think it is or isn't, but if it's true that they're keeping all their secret bases under children's hospitals, right? Horrifying. That's just fucked. Like, what do we do with that? Like, I don't know. And if you say you do know what to do in response to that, know how you're able to have the conversation. Like, it's easy to say Netanyahu's an asshole, but like, if I were Netanyahu right now and my kidnapped citizens were under children's hospitals where Hamas was hiding, would I go and murder kids to get them back? I have no fucking idea. How would you possibly handle that situation? And people who are certain that they know the way to handle that situation is almost a conversation ender for me. Because like, I just don't, the facts are so uncertain. But even if you take what Israel is saying as true,
if you take what Hamas says is true about themselves, and if you take what Israel says is true, it's true about themselves, there's no easy answer.
I still have no idea what to do. Right. If you want to back up, 6 months, I could say, I think this thing where Israel settlers are trying to get more and more land for Israel, I am theoretically against that because I don't really know what's going on there, but it seems like that's going to lead to some pissed off people. Like, I had an opinion about that.
Yeah.
It maybe wasn't grounded in a full factual understanding. It was grounded in, I have read a bunch about nonfiction about the forming of Israel, which has, again, led me to distrust nonfiction more. Right. But I did have some opinions then, which I could engage in a conversation with. But now, how the fuck does anyone know how to proceed? Like, so saying anything other than, this is fucked, something has to happen, I hope it's the right thing, I understand why they're approaching it in this way, I understand why it's morally dangerous. Anybody who goes beyond that and has some degree of certainty, like, well, Hamas is responsible for the death of those kids, so we don't need to worry about that. Like,
there's no like,
really?
Anybody who's saying we don't need to worry about that feels like.
So I don't claim to have better answers than even Netanyahu, who I think is a real piece of shit. I don't know what I would do in his situation right now. So if anybody does, I just don't know how to have that conversation. I feel like this makes sense as a conversational endpoint to what we're trying to wrap our minds around, starting with Ariely and Gino going to Gladwell and Hassan Minhaj and Jonah Lehrer and other folks you meant. There's an expectation of fact and truth leading to a certainty of how people should behave is just anathema to my vision of the world.
You're one of the assassins in the cult that Nietzsche talks about, who believe that nothing is true and everything is permissible.
I know you're joking
Yeah,
because I
yeah,
don't believe that everything is
yeah,
permissible,
yeah.
right? I believe that nothing is true, but there are a whole lot of things that aren't permissible still,
Sure, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
like, how do you get to the without God, how do you get to those sort of fundamentals? And then that's a conversation for another day. But
Yeah.
I do live assuming most of what I am told to be useful as a primary source, but not true.
Yeah. All right. I have a very low level, uh, much more prac- practical, uh, extremely limited band-aid of a solution to the fraudulent social scientist, pundit, comedian problem,
Please.
which is because I think like what's so remarkable about Malcolm Gladwell to me is that he can be so good and so bad. That like
Yeah,
he will both say like he's had pieces, audio pieces, written pieces that I think are like incredibly insightful and really brilliant and really touching, and then he can be such an asshole or such a like irresponsible liar guy. Like
totally.
that, between that and the Paul Damon and the Jonah Lair and Dan Ariely, like part of my thought is that there's the question of how much truth you should tell and how much you should, how much you should balance this question of truth versus impact or emotion or whatever. But then there's also the question of how much you're being asked to do. And so it seems to me that like one of the places where a lot of these people really get into trouble is when they're getting calls from everybody and they're saying yes to everything.
Another way of agreeing with what you're saying, but from a slightly different perspective, is that in order to be a Malcolm Gladwell who is able to write up these awful opinions,
Mhm.
you sort of do need to be pretty good at
Yeah, yeah,
thinking of the right opinion. Like
yeah,
you
yeah,
do
yeah.
have to get it right, or at least get it compelling enough times for people to come to you with just a constant never-ending stream of opportunities. And reading this piece about Gino and Ariely, it seems like they're both super hardworking,
Brilliant.
like
Yeah.
brilliant thinkers. I
Mhm.
don't think that I would, like, most people would have the opportunity to forge as much data as they
No.
did, just because they. So I don't think it's just a product of, once you do it, you don't have time to focus, or you are trying to do so much that it's easier to fake some data. I think it's, people get a lot more latitude once they show that they are leaders in their field.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that even like that people said that about Madoff. Like it took
Right,
a genius to run the thing he was running. Like that was an incredibly impressive fake operation.
right.
Um,
Just as maybe a final question, because I don't know where you're going to come off on this, is in the realm of people who claim to be telling the truth.
yeah.
So not novelists, but people who claim to be telling the truth. Scientists, the type of Gladwell Lehrer writers we're talking about, social scientists, I guess I mean, the type of Gladwell Lehrer writers
Science
we're talking
writers. Yeah.
about, the type of like monologists, but like people who are telling stories on stage. Like,
Yeah.
what percentage of, if you group all these together, people do you think are outright frauds? Like, are people who fuck with the data, who like claim to be doing something that they are not doing? And what percentage are in this gray area of taking advantage of the tools of narrative, but are telling themselves that they're doing the right thing? Because I think that at a certain part, Gino, just lie, like knew that she was
Yeah.
lying. And she said, like, I'm lying now, but I'm doing it because I can or because I want to. And those are like, whether you want to call them psychopaths or not, those are people who know that they are lying. What percentage do you think know that they're lying? What percentage do you think are using narrative techniques to tell stories that aren't really the right story? And what percentage are just like fully perfect story manifestors?
Yeah, I think probably the percentage of people who were extremely scrupulous and ethical is about the same as the percentage of people who are total psychopaths.
I was going to say the same thing.
And I think probably the people who are like very, very hardworking and really rigorous and really honest are also probably the easiest for the psychopaths to do. Like to get, which is how like people get signed on to some of these projects and then later discover that like, oh my God, this study was faked and I got brought on as an author. I think that there's an enormous gray area, but it is sort of like, it's a little bit like Twilight. Like, I think almost everybody is telling some version of a story to themselves about how this is sort of okay, or it's a little bit of a like you're telling yourself a story about like, oh, I'm fudging a little bit, but I also think like my guess is your essay might have been the most scrupulous one in that book.
Right.
Like you're the
Right.
one saying like, oh, I know I'm lying a little bit, but
Totally.
really you're quite careful
But I did
about
my
what you're
best. Right.
and you're careful about what kinds of things you are really sticking to. I just think at a certain point, like, well, is it night? That's a little darker. It's a little darker. At a certain point, like you can't see to tie your shoes.
So
Like at
are
a certain
you,
point, you fall into a hole.
for the sake of, I don't know, the game theory of podcasting, is the middle group, of which I count myself, 98%, and it's 1% people who are actual frauds and 1% people who are saints? Or is it 50, 25, 25? Like in your breakdown, I realize I'm asking you to conflate a whole bunch of categories, including scientists, social scientists, and stand-up comedians. So it's a silly setup, but I honestly don't know where you're going to put the
I
percentage.
think probably if you're like by the most rigorous standards, it probably is like 1 and 98. I think that there's probably a very meaty portion on either end that is effectively in good faith with themselves, but has some insight into like in good or in bad faith with themselves, but has some degree of insight. Like I think you're not actually in the 98%. I think you're probably in the like 10 to 20% of people who are really basically honest and rigorous, but also like have an awareness. Like you're not like a total weirdo who only eats like grapefruit and liver and has like one suit that you have 15 copies of and you don't understand emotion. Like you're not like a weird, like probably the people who are at the far end are almost like half functional human beings, and they can be so morally perfect in this way that like you have too much emotional insight to be like totally pure. But I think you're probably in the like 10 to 20% of like you're quite honest, but you have some awareness of the flexibility of the whole enterprise. And I think probably it's like 1 98 and then like 80 20 on either end, like to like 20 60 20 or something like that, with a big gross muddy 60 in the middle.
20 58 21,
something like that.
Is that? Yeah.
I think most people are basically trying to do their job, but also definitely know they're kind of fudging. Like I think like that's sort of like the way almost everybody is with taxes. It's like
right.
Like honestly, like I would like to be perfectly 100% honest with my taxes. I almost don't know how to do that. Like I almost like don't have enough technical. I would have to become an accountant to know how to be most perfectly honest. Yeah, I think that's probably most people, and I think you're a good fake journalist.
Thanks,
slash real novelist.
That's all I aspire to be.
That was my conversation with Brian. You can hear us talk about being parents and raising kids and running into problems, some of which were so dire I did feel like I needed to put them on The Secret Show. So that'll be up in a couple of days at sleerickets.substack.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.